I want you to go back exactly 50 years and travel 6,500 miles east. Instead of being in a synagogue in Jupiter, Florida, in the year of 2023, you're now in one of the 1,000 synagogues in Israel, 1973. The occasion is Yom Kippur morning services. The date happened to be back then October 6th. The cantor leads the prayer following the familiar melodies when all of a sudden a soldier comes up on the bima and starts reading names of some young men. He tells them that each man who is being called must immediately report back to their military base. These soldiers, for the most part, are not in active duty. They're all reservists. But in Israel, almost everyone, the ages of 20, 30, and even in their 40s, is a reservist, since the Israeli military is made mostly, at least 2/3, of reservists. The soldier does not explain why, but everyone understands that if they are being called to serve their country during the holiest day of the year, it means that Israel has been attacked or is just about to be attacked. Many of these young men are sitting there next to their own fathers. The mothers are on the other side of the mechitza or upstairs. Some of them have their own children. On some occasions, fathers and sons are being called. Just imagine the tears, the fear that it might be the last time that they see each other, or the fear that when they finally see each other, they will not be so whole in body and in spirit. But before I continue from Yom Kippur morning, I want us to go back exactly 50 years ago, but following the regular calendar, September 25th, 1973. And now you're not in a synagogue, you are sitting at the Mossad headquarters near Tel Aviv. The Mossad is the Israel espionage, intelligence institution, the equivalent to the CIA of the United States. And in the guest house of the Mossad, there is a top secret, highly surprising guest. His Majesty King Hussein of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. It's 1973. Jordan was officially in war with Israel, a country enemy. There were only few Israelis there. Among them was Golda Meir, Israeli Prime Minister, and Zamir, the head of the Mossad. What was King Hussein doing in Tel Aviv? Well, he came to warn Israel that only 2 days ago, he attended a summit in Cairo, Egypt, where he learned that Egypt and Syria are about to attack Israel in the next days. He didn't have the D-date, he didn't have the H-hour, but he knew it was imminent. And the reason that he came to Israel was to try against all odds to convince Golda and the rest of the leadership in Israel to start some peace negotiations with the Arabs and perhaps to be able to prevent a war. The Israelis thanked the king. When he left, they got together, called some of the Israeli generals. The important one at that time was the chief of staff, General Elazar, known in Israel as Dado, and the head of the intelligence unit, Eli Zeira, and they all agreed that the odds for a war between Israel and Egypt were very slim. They said that in May, several months earlier, the king had already warned Israel about an upcoming war, but nothing happened the way that the Israeli predicted, and therefore the king is wrong again. In the days that followed, the Israeli intelligence, that is and was one of the best in the world, kept getting intelligence that shows that a war is around the corner. And yet, every day, the official report started by the odds of a war with Syria or with Egypt are very slim. When I was recruited to the intelligence unit in 1988, the first thing I had to memorize was a list that in Hebrew is called simanim matrim. It's a warning signs, like red flags, that when you recognize them, you know that there might be a pending war. And I'm not talking about the obvious things like mobilizing large units. These are small things, like you learn that the Arabs cancel vacations of military personnel. Or you learn that foreign diplomats and foreign advisors are leaving the area. That's a red flag. The Israeli intelligence knew all of that. The legendary unit that today everyone knows it by the name of 8200 unit, this is where all the amazing Israeli startups started from, this unit. They had the information, but they all interpreted it as an alarm. They interpreted information as if the Arabs are only having a military exercise and will not dare to attack Israel. What made them so confident? Mainly two things. First, they held in contempt the ability of the Arab soldiers. In 1948, 1956, and 1967, the Israeli army was able to defeat the Arabs, even when the Israeli army was about a third of the size of the combined Arab militaries. They didn't think that they have the right weapon or the right training, so they wouldn't dare. But more than that, there was in Israel what we call a conceptia, which is the Hebrew word for a concept. The concept said that Egypt will not dare to attack Israel unless Egypt is certain that it can defeat the Israelis, especially when they're sure that their air force is as strong as the Israeli air force. And they also knew, according to the concept, that Syria will never dare to attack Israel without Egypt. So since it sounds like the Talmud, Egypt is not strong enough to defeat Israel, and they knew that, they won't attack Israel, and therefore the Syrians will not attack Israel. The Israeli intelligence had a secret weapon. Only recently, people started to write about it when the documents became available to the public. Early in 1973, one of the commando units of Israel crossed the border into Egypt, and tapped the most important communication lines. These communication lines led information to and from the most important army bases and political offices. This system was so expensive and quite fragile, so the Israelis decided to use it only when things are really worrisome. Despite all the information that Israel had, they never activated the system. When the head of the Israeli intelligence, Zeira, was told to do it, he was the only person with the authority to do it, he gave everyone the impression that he did. But he was so certain that the Arabs will not attack that he didn't want to waste that system on the situation. So that was the concept. October 5th, Erev Yom Kippur, the eve of Yom Kippur, 2:30 a.m. The Mossad is getting a phone call from its most praised and expensive asset, using the code word for a war. Immediately, the head of the Mossad flew to London to meet with this asset, from whom he learned that the Egyptians and the Syrians are going to attack Israel in the next 24 hours. He was not sure exactly when, but he expected it to be 6 p.m. And why was he so sure? Because he had the Egyptian military plans, which he had given Israel several months prior. And what this plan says, that 24 hours before an attack, Egypt will take all of its aircraft of Egypt Air, Egypt's national airline, take them to Libya to spare them should an attack will happen. That's exactly what they did. The head of the Mossad, Zamir, was convinced that the information was true. Now, later on, we learned who was this asset, this agent. His name was Marwan, Ashraf Marwan, and he was the son-in-law of the previous Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. And even after Nasser died, he remained part of the tiny elite of Egypt. He was privy to almost everything, and he has proven his knowledge by giving Israel the best intelligence ever. Each time he made the phone call, by the way, he got $50,000. But it was worth it if they only listened to him. At that time, the head of the Mossad was convinced. The end of the Israeli military, Dado was convinced. But in order to do something, he needed to get the approval of the political leadership. Golda Meir was the prime minister, and Moshe Dayan, the most decorated, the most celebrated general, not only in Israel, in the world. He got the credit for the 67 war, for the 6-day war. He was considered to be a military genius. Dayan did not think that the Egyptians will attack, despite all the intelligence. He wanted Israel to recruit, to mobilize only 20,000 soldiers. Eventually, the chief of staff convinced Golda to allow him to have 100,000 out of the 200,000 that they needed, but he failed to convince them to allow the Israeli Air Force to attack first. No preemptive attack. This debate is going on in Israel till this day, whether or not Golda did the right thing. The reason that Golda did not want the Israeli Air Force to attack the Syrian Air Force first was an agreement she had with the United States, with Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. According to this agreement, the U.S. committed to help Israel during a war only if Israel is being attacked first. If Israel will initiate a war, they said, you can forget any help from us. Golda had a huge dilemma. Calling Kissinger's bluff, relying on his Jewish heart, that he would ultimately will not let the Jewish state be defeated, or not. She didn't. I've read a lot about Henry Kissinger, and the more I learn about him, the more I know that Golda was right. Kissinger still is. He's over 100-year-old now, Jewish. But he was the Secretary of State. And Israel's interest at that time was not a priority for him. And when we read more about him, we see that often he didn't like to be identified as a Jew. He thought that it was just pulled him back from being even more successful than he was. And Golda, and I paraphrase what she said, during the war, we will need help from others. Israel knew it didn't have enough weapons to survive a long war. And if we start the war, nobody in the world will help us. So Israel knew that they will be attacked very late, only in the morning of October 6th. And they knew that it will happen at 6 p.m. Still October 6, 12:30 p.m., Yom Kippur. For the first time, the Israeli ministers hear about the situation. They knew nothing about what was happening. And at 12:30, they heard that there is a good chance that in the next few hours, Israel will be attacked, and very little of the reservists were mobilized to the borders. Can you imagine the shock, the fear in this room? The Israeli military assessed that they need only 2 days to mobilize all the forces to the borders. The border with Egypt was in the south, just across the Suez Canal, and the border with Syria was in the north, at the Golan Heights. They needed 2 days, and they were promised at least 5 to 6 days to prepare for a war. After all, we had the best intelligence in the world. They got few hours. During that government meeting, 2 p.m., not 6 p.m., the Arabs started the war. And what happened there is heartbreaking. In the Golan Heights, the Syrians had 5 divisions, 1,400 tanks, 1,000 pieces of artillery. Israel had 177 tanks. 1,400 Syrian tanks versus 177. In the southern border with Egypt, the Egyptians in the first few hours of the war mobilized 100,000 soldiers across the canal, had 1,000 tanks, 2,000 artillery units, and Israel had 546 soldiers. Almost none of them has ever been to a war. Most of them have not survived. In Israel, Yom Kippur is not just the holiest day of the year, but in many ways it's the yahrzeit of this war. In the Arab world, it's a day of victory. But the truth is that Israel won the war. Israel defeated Egypt and Syria. Yes, it took a few days for the Israeli reservists to get to where they were supposed to be. They did not expect the Arabs to have an advanced anti-tank and anti-airplane missiles. It was all new, but they found ways around it. And in a few days, everything turned around and Israel was the attacker. On October 15th, Israeli tanks were only 60 miles from Cairo. and Israeli artillery was in a range of hitting Damascus, the capital of Syria. But for us, it was a defeat. Experts say that from a military point of view, it was the best war that Israel ever had. Because 67, yes, Israel defeated them in 6 days, but they did it because they were the first to attack. They destroyed the entire air force of Egypt and Syria on the ground, and they had no air force. But here, from being defeated, Israel in the beginning for a few days, to turn everything around and to end up winning the war, that takes genius. That takes perseverance. That takes all the skills of the Israeli soldiers. And by the way, they underappreciated the Egyptian soldiers. They were not weak and stupid the way they were before. They were well trained by the Russians with good weapons and were quite determined to win. Why am I telling you this story today? First of all, because it's 50 years anniversary, and it's a very important part of Jewish history that we all have to know. But also because of the whole idea of the concept. Sometimes, not only countries, but we too, are so certain that we are right, that any kind of information we get that contradicts it, we explain it away. We are biased to listen only to information that strengthens and supports our opinions and our beliefs. And other things we ignore. The Israeli scientist Danny Kahneman got a Nobel Prize for basically arguing that. He, by the way, happened to be in the United States in 1973 and was one of many Israelis who flew back to help in the war. So this certainty that we have sometimes that causes us to ignore the information happens all the time, you know? You hear that Jews are obsessed with money. And then you learn that Jews are actually one of the most generous group in the world. Would it change your mind? No. So of course they're generous because they help only their own people. But then you learn that no, actually Jews give most of their money to non-Jewish causes. Would that change your mind? Absolutely not. Because Jews, love to see their names on buildings. But they're still awful, cheap people. You can think of any example you want, and it works. This certainty bias. The other thing, my friends, never underestimate your enemies. Even if they did not show strength and wisdom in the beginning, they too, as God is telling us today, can change and grow and get better every year. And the Arabs did just that. Luckily, the Israelis were still better. But this quality gap shrank dramatically. And the last thing, we survived the war because on the 9th day, the US sent us all the weapons, all the airplanes, all the tanks that we needed. And with that, we're able to defeat Egypt and Syria. This has not changed. Israel is much stronger now, much smarter, much more experienced. But still, without the support of the United States and without the support of us, the American Jews who fight for this support, it won't be so successful in a future conflict. And it may happen sooner than we think. So let's learn from these mistakes of 50 years ago. And let's pray that will keep an open mind will never follow these certainty biases and will never have to test it in reality. Because one day, hopefully, there will be peace, even in the Middle East. Shana Tova.